1:19 a.m. Fordow Fuel Enrichment Plant, Qom Province, Iran. 34 degrees north latitude, 50 degrees east longitude. Depth 80 meters. The facility had been built inside a mountain. The decision to place it there had been made in 2004 by engineers who understood that a facility visible from orbit would eventually be targeted, and that the question was not whether it would be targeted, but whether a weapon existed that could reach it. At 80 meters of granite overburden, with reinforced concrete at every interior junction, the facility had been designed around a specific technical assumption: that the only non-nuclear munition with any probability of achieving structural effect at operational depth was the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, and that the GBU-57 required a B-2 Spirit to deliver it, and that the B-2 would need to penetrate Iranian airspace, and that the Iranian air defense network could complicate that penetration sufficiently to reduce the weapon's probability of achieving its designed effect. For 11 years, that assumption had been correct. The assumption had 3 components, and all 3 had been addressed in the 18 months preceding the current operation. The first component, the GBU-57's penetration depth, had been addressed through a modification program that increased the weapon's terminal velocity and improved its penetrating performance against granite overburden by approximately 22%. Bringing the expected penetration depth against Fordow's specific geology from 54 meters to 66 meters. 66 meters of penetration against 80 meters of overburden still left a margin. The modification had been supplemented by a sequential strike protocol. 2 GBU-57 weapons delivered in rapid sequence against the same entry point, with the first weapon creating a precursor cavity that the second weapon would penetrate to additional depth. Combined sequential penetration against Fordow's specific geology, assessed at 79 to 84 meters, the 80-meter overburden, the 79 to 84-meter combined penetration. The margin was measured in meters and in probability, and it was the number that had determined the operational authorization threshold. A probability of greater than 51% for achieving structural effect at operational depth. The threshold the NSC had established as the minimum acceptable for authorizing an operation with the geopolitical consequences of a direct strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure. The penetration probability assessment had reached 67% at the 18-month mark. The operations authorization had been pending that number for 29 months. The second component, B-2 survivability in Iranian airspace, had been addressed through an electronic suppression architecture that combined F-35I Wild Weasel sorties from the UAE with EA-18G Growlers support from the Carrier Strike Group in the Persian Gulf and a simultaneous USCYBERCOM operation against the Iranian Integrated Air Defense Systems Coordination Network. The combination was assessed to degrade the IADS sufficiently to reduce the B-2's detection probability to below the threshold required for a Bavar 373 engagement during the ingress profile. The third component, the question of whether the operation would happen at all, had been resolved at 11:44 p.m. the previous evening, when the International Atomic Energy Agency's emergency notification system had transmitted a signal to its member states indicating that the agency's continuous enrichment monitoring equipment at the Fordow facility had recorded an enrichment level of 89.7% over the preceding 6-hour monitoring window. The monitoring equipment had been designed to detect exactly this event. It had been installed under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Actions Verification Protocol in 2016. The equipment was still functioning. It had reported correctly. 89.7% enriched uranium-235 at the Fordow facility. The device assembly threshold was assessed at 90%. The technical margin between the IAEA's notification and a functional weapon was measured in days, not weeks. The intelligence community had assessed that the final assembly steps taking enriched material and configuring it into a functional device, would require approximately 11 days at the facility in Parchin, where the assembly infrastructure was assessed to be located. 11 days. The operation had been planned for 29 months. The authorization had been waiting for the enrichment number. The number had arrived. The NSC principals had been assembled at 10:31 p.m. The intelligence assessment, the legal review, and the operational briefing had been presented simultaneously. The authorization deliberation had taken 73 minutes. The authorizing document had been signed at 11:44 p.m. The authorization covered 4 facilities. Fordow, for the enrichment infrastructure at depth. Natanz, for the advanced centrifuge halls that the IAEA had been monitoring and that housed the second generation of the enrichment program. The Isfahan uranium conversion facility, where the feedstock for the enrichment program was produced. And the Parchin military complex, specifically the building assessed as the assembly infrastructure location, where the final stage of device construction was assessed to be pending. The authorization also covered a coordination framework that had been the subject of 11 months of bilateral planning, and that had produced an operational integration protocol that both governments had committed to maintaining in strict compartmentation until the authorization decision was made. The framework was a joint operation. The Israeli Air Force's F-35I Adir fleet had been conducting its training cycle with the specific strike package for Natanz and Isfahan for 11 months. The F-35I's AN/APG-81 AESA radar and its stealth profile gave it a survivability margin in Iranian airspace that the IAF had validated through 7 test ingress profiles conducted during the periodic escalation cycles that had given the Israeli government plausible cover for the aerial activity. The Israeli government had not announced those profiles. The Iranian Air Defense Network had been working to correlate them for 7 months. The Parchin target, the building at the Parchin military complex, had been assigned to the U.S. strike package as well, as a parallel effort to Fordow. The GBU-57 was the designated weapon. Parchin was a surface facility. A single GBU-57 would be sufficient. At 1:19 a.m., the first B-2 Spirit reached its first designated release point, 240 kilometers south of Fordow. The B-2 had been airborne from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri for 11 hours and 22 minutes. It had been supported by 4 KC-135 tanker passes over the Indian Ocean and had crossed Iranian airspace at 16,000 meters altitude. The EA-18G electronic suppression had been active since 1:04 a.m. The USCYBERCOM operation against the IADS coordination network had been active since 12:47 a.m. 2 F-35I aircraft from the UAE had been executing HARM and AARGM-ER engagements against the 3 Bavar 373 fire control radars covering the southern approach corridor since 1:11 a.m. Of the 3 Bavar 373 fire control radars in the southern corridor, 2 were offline from AARGM-ER impact. One had gone passive at 1:14 a.m. Its operators had recognized the pattern of preceding strikes and had shut down their emissions before the 3rd AARGM-ER reached its position. A passive Bavar 373 could still track the B-2 through its passive infrared mode if the B-2 came within approximately 140 kilometers. The B-2's planned approach track kept it at a minimum of 180 kilometers from the passive radar's last known position. At 1:19 a.m., the release authorization was confirmed, and the first GBU-57 was released. At Mach 1.5 terminal velocity, the weapon covered the 240-kilometer standoff distance in approximately 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Impact: 1:24 a.m. The seismograph at the University of Tehran's Geophysics Monitoring Station, 160 kilometers from Fordow, registered a 2.4 magnitude event. The seismograph at the Iranian Meteorological Organization station at Kashan registered a 2.3. The two readings were consistent with a penetrating detonation at approximately 60 to 70 meters depth, within the modified GBU-57's assessed penetration range. The B-2 had already maneuvered to its second release point during the first weapon's flight time. The second GBU-57 was released at 1:26 a.m. against the same entry point, exploiting the precursor cavity created by the first impact. Kashan registered a 2.1 magnitude event. The structural assessment of Fordow would require days of seismic analysis, signals intelligence on facility communications traffic, and eventually overhead imagery of any surface effects. The on-site enrichment monitoring equipment had gone offline at 1:24 a.m., consistent with a power disruption from the first impact. Whether the power disruption indicated structural damage at operational depth or simply disruption of the facility's surface infrastructure would require additional analysis. What was immediately available? The IAEA's enrichment monitoring equipment had gone offline. The facility's communications had gone dark. The seismic signature was consistent with deep structural effect. Assessment confidence: 71% probability of operational degradation to below functional status at the primary enrichment level. The assessment would be revised as additional intelligence arrived. The Israeli operation had activated simultaneously with the B-2's first weapon release. 16. F-35I aircraft, organized into 4 flights of 4, had been airborne from Nevatim Air Base since 11:58 p.m. Their routing had taken them through Saudi airspace under a deconfliction protocol that had been the subject of the most sensitive element of the 11-month bilateral planning framework. A protocol that neither government had publicly acknowledged and that the Saudi government had authorized at the highest level on the basis of a security assessment that the Iranian nuclear program represented a more immediate threat to regional stability than the political complexity of the airspace access. The F-35I's stealth profile was effective against the Iranian radar network's standard operating mode. Against the S-300 PMU, 2 batteries protecting Natanz, an upgraded Soviet-era system whose early 2000s detection algorithms had been calibrated against the radar cross-section characteristics of 4th-generation aircraft. The F-35I's low observable profile produced acquisition ranges that the Israeli mission planning team had modeled as approximately 40% shorter than the S-300's nominal detection envelope. 40% shorter acquisition range, plus the IADS network disruption from the USCYBERCOM operation, plus the EA-18G Growlers suppression that was simultaneously covering the Israeli ingress corridor, produced an engagement window per F-35I that the Israeli Air Force's planning team had assessed as acceptable for a mission of this significance. At 1:21 a.m., the first flight of 4 F-35s reached their Natanz release point. Their weapons load: 4 GBU-53/B, Stormbreaker precision munitions each, plus 2 GBU-28 bunker-penetrating weapons per aircraft for the primary centrifuge hull structures. The Stormbreaker's millimeter wave seeker allowed precise targeting of the centrifuge hull ventilation shafts, a targeting approach that the Israeli planning team had developed over 14 months of facility study, designed to deliver effects into the underground centrifuge hulls through their ventilation infrastructure, rather than through direct structural penetration. The GBU-28 strikes against the primary and secondary centrifuge hull access structures were designed to collapse the access corridors and seal the hulls, not necessarily destroying the centrifuges, which were deep enough to survive, but sealing them in place with no accessible entry for repair operations. The first Stormbreaker impacts on the Natanz ventilation infrastructure were confirmed at 1:24 a.m. The first GBU-28 strikes on the access structures at 1:26 a.m. The S-300 PMU-2 battery protecting Natanz's southern approach had acquired 1 F-35I at 1:23 a.m., an acquisition that the flight lead had been alerted to by his radar warning receiver. He had maneuvered and deployed countermeasures. The S-300 had launched 2 interceptors, Both had missed the maneuvering aircraft. The S-300 battery had revealed its precise position by firing. A HARM missile from one of the two F-35As, accompanying the strike package as SEAD escort, had been fired at the acquired radar position at 1:23 a.m., reaching the battery at 1:25 a.m. The S-300 at Natanz was offline. The second flight of 4 F-35Is was already at its Isfahan release point at 1:24 a.m. The Isfahan uranium conversion facility's primary processing buildings, the structures where uranium ore was converted into uranium hexafluoride feedstock, were surface targets. No bunker penetration required. GBU-31 JDAM with a 900-kilogram warhead against the primary processing hall roofline. 8 GBU-31 impacts across 3 Isfahan UCF structures between 1:24 a.m. and 1:27 a.m. The primary processing hall and both secondary processing structures were assessed as non-operational from structural damage visible on the post-strike synthetic aperture radar pass at 1:44 a.m. The Parchin military complex strike, the B-2's secondary target, designated for the building assessed as the assembly infrastructure location, was executed at 1:31 a.m. A single GBU-57. The Parchin building was a surface structure. Single weapon strike. The building received a direct impact. Structural assessment. Non-operational. The IRGC air defense network had been activated since 1:11 a.m. when the first AARGM-ER engagement of the Bavar 373 radars had been detected. The network's response had been progressively degraded by the layered suppression architecture. USCYBERCOM operations reducing coordination speed, EA-18G jamming reducing radar coherence, AARGM-ER and HARM reducing active radar nodes. By 1:24 a.m., the IADS was operating at an estimated 34% of its normal coordination effectiveness. 34% was not zero. It was enough to generate 1 S-300 acquisition, 1 engagement, and 2 misses. It was not enough to engage the B-2 at 16,000 meters altitude or to prevent the Israeli F-35I package from completing their strikes. At 1:29 a.m., the third Israeli flight completed its Natanz secondary target set strikes. At 1:33 a.m., the fourth flight executed a redundancy strike against one Natanz structure, whose post-strike sensor assessment had indicated the initial GBU-28 impact had not achieved the designed sealing effect. The second GBU-28 against that structure was confirmed effective. The B-2 was already aggressing southwest when the fourth Israeli flight completed its mission. Both B-2 aircraft were clear of Iranian airspace by 1:41 a.m. The Israeli F-35I package was in Syrian airspace by 1:38 a.m., routing home on the egress track that the deconfliction protocol had established. The entire active engagement window over Iranian territory. 22 minutes. From the first GBU-57 release at 1:19 a.m. to the last F-35I weapon release at 1:33 a.m., the IRGC had fired 2 interceptors and missed. The Iranian Air Force had scrambled 4 F-14A Tomcats from the Tehran Air Defense Base at 1:16 a.m. when the AARGM-ER engagements were detected. The F-14A had been in Iranian inventory since 1974. Its radar system, the AN/AWG-9, was operational. Its AIM-54 Phoenix missiles were in partially maintained condition. The 4 aircraft had been vectored toward the northern approach zone, where the IADS coordination network had assessed the primary strike package to be routing. Based on the degraded sensor picture, the network had generated an incorrect sector assessment. The F-14As had been vectored north. The strikes were happening in the south and west. By the time the Iranian Air Force corrected the vector, the strike packages were egressing. At 1:44 a.m., the first post-strike satellite pass completed its synthetic aperture radar collection over all 4 target sites. The analysis was transmitted to both governments simultaneously at 1:51 a.m. Fordow. Surface infrastructure impacts confirmed. Primary access corridor, non-functional. Underground facility communications, dark since 1:24 a.m. Seismic signatures consistent with deep structural effect. Assessment confidence, 71% operational degradation. The facility's status at depth, whether the centrifuge halls and enrichment infrastructure had been functionally disabled or merely disrupted, would require additional collection. Natanz, advanced centrifuge hall ventilation infrastructure confirmed compromised. Primary and secondary access corridors, sealed from GBU-58 impacts. Secondary centrifuge hall, partial structural damage. Assessment, operational capability reduced to below primary enrichment capacity. Estimated reconstitution timeline, 18 to 24 months minimum for the sealed halls, assuming access could be restored. Isfahan UCF, primary and secondary processing structures non-operational. Feedstock production, assessed as non-functional. Reconstitution timeline, 6 to 12 months for primary processing capacity. Parchin, targeted building non-operational from direct GBU-57 impact. Assembly infrastructure within the building, assessed as non-functional. Whether any assembly stage material had been relocated before the strike was the critical intelligence question, not resolvable from the synthetic aperture radar pass alone. The political dimension of the operation was already activating as the assessment was being transmitted. The Iranian government had been aware of the strike since 1:19 a.m. Its public response would come in the hours following the operation, and it would be managed through channels that both the US and Israeli governments had prepared for. The IAEA had been notified through an emergency channel at 1:47 a.m. The notification that both governments were legally required to provide regarding the strike on a facility under IAEA monitoring. The UN Security Council's emergency session had been requested at 1:49 a.m. The geopolitical consequences of the operation were not the operational planner's responsibility. The operational outcome was the operational outcome. 4 facilities engaged, all 4 assessed as significantly degraded or non-operational. The enrichment program's path to a functional device had been assessed as requiring a minimum of 18 to 24 months to reconstitute, assuming access to replacement centrifuge equipment, feedstock production restoration, and restoration of the Fordow infrastructure. 18 to 24 months. That was the window the operation had created. What was done with that window was above the operational planning level's authority to determine. 2:09 a.m. Nevatim Air Base, Israel. Squadron operations. The last F-35 I had landed at 2:07 a.m. All 16 aircraft had returned. No Israeli aircraft had been engaged by Iranian interceptors. The S-300 that had fired had missed. The harm had eliminated the S-300's fire control capability before a second engagement could be generated. Every aircraft had returned with its crew. The squadron operations officer filed the sortie completion log at 2:09 a.m. 16 aircraft departed. 16 aircraft returned. Target set. 4 facilities, all engaged. Assessment, pending final intelligence analysis. He logged the completion time and submitted the aircraft maintenance schedule for the next cycle. 2:14 a.m. Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri. B-2 operations. The B-2 aircraft were still 10 hours from their landing. They were over the Indian Ocean, beginning their return transit under tanker support. The mission logs were being transmitted through secure link in real time. The crews had been in their cockpits for 13 hours and 40 minutes. They had 4 hours of crew rest remaining before the mandatory rest requirement would require a crew rotation at the tanker rendezvous point. They were flying home. The mountains over Fordow were behind them. The seismographs at Kashan and Tehran had recorded their work. Time from operation authorization to last weapon release, 109 minutes. Time of active engagement window over Iranian territory, 22 minutes. Time from last weapon release to post-strike satellite assessment. 18 minutes. U.S. systems employed. 2B-2 Spirit aircraft with 4 GBU-57 MOP total. 2 F-35A with AARGM-ER against Bavar. 373 radars. EA-18G Growlers providing continuous electronic suppression. USCYBERCOM operation against IADS coordination network beginning at 12:47 a.m. Total U.S. precision munitions, 4 GBU-57 MOP, plus supporting suppression weapons. Israeli systems employed, 16 F-35I Adir aircraft. GBU-53/B, Stormbreaker. GBU-28 bunker penetrators. GBU-31, JDAM. 2 F-35, ASEAD escort with HARM. Total Israeli strike aircraft, 18. Iranian air defense response. 2 S-300 PMU-2 interceptors launched, both missed. 4 F-14A Tomcat interceptors scrambled, vectored to incorrect sector, no engagements. Facility assessments. Fordow, 71% confidence of operational degradation. Underground status pending. Natanz, hull sealed. Primary enrichment capacity non-functional. Reconstitution 18 to 24 months. Isfahan UCF, non-operational. Reconstitution 6 to 12 months. Parchin, targeted building, non-operational. Enrichment program operational status. Assessed as no functional path to device completion for a minimum of 18 months. Subject to revision as additional intelligence arrives on facility status at depth and on material pre-positioned before the strike. U.S. and Israeli aircraft losses, 0. U.S. and Israeli personnel, 0 injuries. Total combined operational cost, including all munitions, aircraft operating hours, and supporting systems. Approximately $1.1 billion. The 89.7% enrichment level that had triggered the authorization. The 71% assessment confidence for Fordow. The 18 to 24-month reconstitution timeline. The 22-minute active engagement window. Each number had its own calculation chain. The 89.7% was a threshold that had been agreed between two governments 29 months earlier as the authorization trigger. The 71% was the penetration probability assessment that had required an 18-month modification program to achieve. The 18 to 24 months was the estimate that justified the operation's consequences. The 22 minutes was the window that 67 minutes of authorization deliberation had produced. The 16 F-35s had returned. The 4 GBU-57s had been delivered. The assessment was 71%. The 29% that the assessment did not cover was the question that would not be answered by the synthetic aperture radar pass. It would be answered in the 18 months that followed. If the reconstitution timeline estimate was correct, the answer would come from the IAEA's monitoring equipment when it was eventually restored to access. The 22-minute window had closed. The 18-month clock had started. Both governments had transmitted their operational completion reports to their respective chain of command at 1:52 a.m. Both had separately transmitted the same number, 22 minutes. The UN Security Council's emergency session was scheduled for 9 a.m. The B-2s were over the Indian Ocean. The mountains over Fordow were quiet.